Picture a rugby pitch. Now picture the kind of man you'd build if you were designing the perfect rugby weapon from scratch. You'd want someone immovable, someone who tips the scales somewhere north of 200 pounds, someone whose thighs could crush a car door, someone who hits like a freight train and runs like one too. Now forget all of that. Because the most dangerous offensive player in world rugby, the man who haunted the dreams of defenders at the 2019 Rugby World Cup, the man who scored one of the most jaw-dropping tries in the history of the sport, stands 5 feet 8 inches tall and weighs less than most linebackers' left leg. His name is Cheslin Kolbe, and this is the story of how a kid from a Cape Town township became the most untouchable winger on the planet. To understand Cheslin Kolbe, you have to understand where he comes from, not just geographically, though geography matters enormously here, but the weight of history that sat on the shoulders of every child born into his community. Cheslin Kolbe was born on the 28th of October, 1993, in Kraaifontein. It's a suburb on the northeastern edge of Cape Town, a place shaped by the long, scarring legacy of apartheid South Africa, where opportunity had been deliberately, systematically withheld from people who looked like Cheslin and his family. This was not ancient history. This was living memory. The ink on South Africa's democratic constitution was barely dry when Cheslin first learned to walk. His father, Elton Kolbe, had played semi-professional rugby. The game ran in the bloodline, and from almost the moment Cheslin could run, which, by all accounts, was immediately and at alarming speed, it was clear that something different had arrived. He grew up in a tight-knit, deeply religious family. His mother's faith and his father's love of sport became the twin pillars of his character. The streets of Kraaifontein were not forgiving, but the rugby fields, however rough and imperfect, were a place where talent could speak louder than circumstance. And Cheslin Kolbe had an awful lot to say. Here's where the story gets complicated. Here's where it almost didn't happen at all. Because from his very earliest days in structured rugby, Cheslin faced a question that would follow him like a shadow for the next 2 decades of his life. The question wasn't asked out loud. Not always. But it was there in every team selection meeting, every coaching conversation, every doubtful glance from a scout who measured him with their eyes before they ever measured his speed with a stopwatch. Is he big enough? He was always the smallest player on the field. Always. Not just smaller than average, genuinely, noticeably small in a sport that had spent decades evolving toward bigger, faster, more physically imposing athletes. Rugby, by the late 2000s, had become a sport that seemed to be selecting against someone like Cheslin Kolbe. And yet he kept playing, he kept excelling, he kept finding ways to make defenders look foolish. He attended Boland Landbu High School, where his rugby talent was undeniable. He was quick, not just fast in a straight line, but quick in that rare, electric way that only the truly special possess. A stop-start quickness. An ability to change direction mid-stride that seemed to defy the physics of the human body. He had football intelligence. He saw angles that other players didn't know existed. But the question kept coming, is he big enough? Stop for a moment. Think about this. The average weight of a Springbok winger has historically hovered around 195 to 210 pounds. Cheslin Kolbe plays at around 172 pounds. That's not a small difference. That's a different category of human being, essentially asked to compete in a contact sport designed for men 30 to 40 pounds heavier. By conventional logic, Cheslin Kolbe should have been playing touch rugby at a company picnic. Instead, he became a World Cup winner. How? The answer begins in Stellenbosch, the DHL Stormers, Western Province Rugby. When Cheslin Kolbe entered the provincial rugby system in South Africa, he found himself in one of the most competitive rugby environments on the planet. Western Province had produced Springbok legends for generations. The expectations were enormous. The scrutiny was relentless. And Cheslin thrived. He made his Super Rugby debut for the Stormers and immediately began doing things that had no established playbook. His game was not built on power. It was built on the weaponization of unpredictability. He ran lines that made defenders commit to the wrong decision. He had a sidestep off either foot, a rarity that could freeze a tackler in the half-second between thought and action. And in that half-second, Cheslin Kolbe was already gone. But the path wasn't smooth. Selection to the Springbok squad, the national team, felt perpetually close and perpetually out of reach. The size question kept surfacing. The rugby establishment is conservative by nature. It trusts the template that has worked before, and Cheslin Kolbe fit no existing template. So he made a decision that would reshape his career entirely. In 2017, Cheslin Kolbe left South Africa. He signed with Toulouse in France's top 14, widely considered the most physically brutal domestic rugby competition in the world. If anything was going to expose his size as a liability, it was this. These were enormous, technically brilliant French and European forwards. These were defenses built on aggression and physicality. What happened instead was something like poetry. In Toulouse, Kolbe didn't just survive. He electrified an entire continent. He became one of the most exciting players in the top 14, then the most exciting full stop. He scored tries that left commentators scrambling for new vocabulary. He made tackles on men who outweighed him by 60 pounds and somehow came out upright. He won, consistently, brilliantly. And the Springbok selectors could no longer look away. His Test debut for South Africa came in 2018, and it arrived not as the climax of a fairy tale but as the beginning of a new chapter entirely, because Cheslin Kolbe was not content to simply be on the team. He wanted to change it. Under head coach Rassie Erasmus, who had taken over a Springbok squad in crisis after a period of declining results, South Africa began rebuilding towards something. Erasmus was a visionary, someone who understood that the game was evolving, that defensive systems were becoming so sophisticated that brute force offense alone would no longer be enough. You needed unpredictability. You needed weapons that defenses couldn't pattern match against. You needed someone like Cheslin Kolbe. He became a cornerstone of Erasmus's vision, not because of what he was supposed to be according to the textbook, but because of what he actually was. A man who could change the game in a single touch. A man whose mere presence on the field forced defensive realignments, created space for teammates, rewired the entire geometry of an opposition's defensive plan. His try-scoring record in a Springbok jersey began to grow. His ability to produce the extraordinary in the most pressurized moments became a reliable constant. The smallest man on the field was becoming its most influential presence. And then came Japan. Here is a fact about the 2019 Rugby World Cup that deserves a moment of stillness. South Africa had not won the World Cup since 2007, 12 years. A nation with one of the most passionate rugby cultures on earth had watched the prize slip away. There was generational hunger in that squad. And Cheslin Kolbe, a man who nearly wasn't there due to an ankle injury that threatened his tournament participation, would end up scoring in the final. Against England. On the world's biggest stage, at 1:45 on the nerves of every South African watching. The 2019 Rugby World Cup was held in Japan, a first for Asia, a moment of genuine global expansion for a sport that had sometimes seemed reluctant to look beyond its traditional heartlands. South Africa arrived as contenders but not heavy favorites. England, New Zealand, Wales each carried different brands of expectation. The Springboks carried something harder to quantify, a hunger that had calcified over years of disappointment and a squad that believed, genuinely believed, in what they were building together. Cheslin Kolbe had nearly missed the entire tournament. An ankle injury in the build-up threatened to derail everything, but he recovered, and in Japan he was unstoppable. He scored a try against Italy that showcased everything that made him extraordinary: the burst of speed, the evasion, the sheer joy of a man doing exactly what he was born to do. His defensive work was ferocious, belying every concern about his physicality. He threw himself into contact with a fearlessness that seemed almost reckless until you understood that fearlessness was itself a tool, part of the psychological arsenal he deployed on every opponent. South Africa moved through the tournament with controlled menace, a dominant semi-final win over Wales, and then the final, England. England arrived as the hottest team in the tournament, having dismantled the All Blacks in a semi-final that turned the entire rugby world upside down. They were confident. They were organized. They had the momentum of something historic at their backs. For 66 minutes, it was a chess match played at gladiatorial intensity, and then Cheslin Kolbe received the ball. What he did next lasted perhaps 8 seconds. He collected the ball wide on the right. He saw space. He drifted inside, drew the defender's weight, then drifted back outside again with a movement so subtle and so perfectly timed that the England player in question was left grasping at air. And Cheslin Kolbe crossed the try-line. The stadium erupted. 66,000 people in Yokohama, tens of millions more watching around the world. And in Kraaifontein and in Stellenbosch and in Cape Town and across South Africa, a nation held its breath and then let it all go at once. South Africa won 32-12. Cheslin Kolbe had written himself into history. But what makes him so good? Because greatness at this level isn't accidental, and it deserves to be understood on its own terms. There is a concept in sports science sometimes called agility intelligence. It's not just the ability to change direction, but the ability to make the right decision about when and where to change direction at speed, before the conscious mind has time to reason through it. It's pattern recognition operating in the body rather than the brain. And Cheslin Kolbe possesses this quality at a level that even among elite athletes is rare. His footwork is studied and imitated. Young wingers around the world watch footage of his sidestep the way aspiring musicians watch concert recordings, trying to understand something that ultimately cannot be fully taught, only felt. There is a rhythm to the way he moves, an almost musical quality to the accelerations and decelerations, the weight shifts and the feints. Then there is his spatial awareness. Kolbe seems to perceive the entire field simultaneously, his own position, the positions of defenders, the angles available to him, the trajectories that will put him in open space. He makes decisions in a third of a second that most players couldn't make in 3. And underpinning all of it is something less measurable but perhaps most important, his absolute refusal to be defined by what he lacks. Cheslin Kolbe never accepted the narrative that his size was a disadvantage. He reframed it. He understood that in a game full of enormous men trying to stop enormous men, a player of his dimensions moving at his speed with his evasive skill was not a weakness. It was a weapon nobody had quite learned to neutralize. Consider this. Between 2019 and 2023, Cheslin Kolbe won the Rugby World Cup, won multiple top 14 titles with Toulouse, was named among the best players in European rugby multiple times, and then signed with Toulon, another French powerhouse, and continued performing at the same extraordinary level. At a time when most players' best years are behind them, Kolbe keeps evolving. What does it mean when the player everyone said was too small keeps outlasting the doubters? Success, for Cheslin Kolbe, did not arrive as a single moment and then fade. It kept accumulating. He became one of the defining figures of the Springbok dynasty that Rassie Erasmus and later Jacques Nienaber built, a dynasty that culminated in a second consecutive World Cup triumph in France in 2023, making South Africa the first nation in history to win 4 Rugby World Cups. Kolbe was there again. He was always there. In France, in 2023, the world saw a more mature version of the player, still electric, still capable of the breathtaking individual moment, but also more influential in the subtleties of the game. Leadership without the armband, a presence that elevated those around him. He has spoken over the years with unusual candor about the doubts he faced, the rejections he absorbed, the coaches who told him he was too small. He doesn't recount these stories with bitterness. He recounts them almost with gratitude, because every closed door, every skeptical glance, every moment when the rugby establishment looked at him and saw a liability instead of a gift, became fuel. It became the quiet engine running beneath every step he took toward greatness. His journey is also inseparable from the broader story of South African rugby's transformation. The Springboks of his generation represent something new, a team whose identity is genuinely reflective of the entire nation, not just a segment of it. When Siya Kolisi lifted the World Cup trophy in 2019 as the first black Springbok captain, it was a moment that transcended sport. Cheslin Kolbe, a colored South African, a descendant of communities that apartheid had tried to erase, was beside him, part of something larger than any individual career, part of history. There is a particular kind of courage required not to shrink in the face of repeated doubt. Not the explosive courage of a tackle or a charge, but the sustained, daily courage of continuing to believe in yourself when the world's template suggests you shouldn't be there. Cheslin Kolbe had that courage. He had it at 15 when coaches shook their heads at his frame. He had it at 23 when he left his home country rather than wait for a system that moved slowly to catch up with his gifts. He had it at 25 on a pitch in Yokohama, late in a World Cup final, when the weight of an entire nation's longing sat on his shoulders, and he put it down as gently and perfectly as a try-scorer can. He is still playing, still evolving, still making defenders look at the replay and wonder what they could possibly have done differently. The smallest player on the pitch, the most dangerous man in the game. Cheslin Kolbe didn't change the sport by overpowering it. He changed it by showing the rugby world something it had forgotten, or perhaps never fully understood, that the game, at its most beautiful, belongs not to the biggest or the heaviest or the most physically imposing, but to the most imaginative, the most fearless, the most determined to prove that greatness has no minimum height requirement. In a sport that told him to be bigger, he chose instead to be better. And it turned out that was more than enough.